What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi. I'm here with Hype Ripper, who's getting washed out by my green screen. Whoopsie daisies, but today we're going to be talking about GT2021. That's right, not GT2020 today, because nestled in a recent announcement was that GT2021 will be available for pre-order from Games Workshop next weekend, meaning that we may get a sneak peek into what's actually in the new mission packet sometime this week, which is pretty exciting and totally out of the blue, although not totally unexpected since it's about 1 year since the GT2020 release. In the meantime, let's engage in some wild and rampant speculation as to what's actually inside this book and my wish list for the top changes to the format. Now, the article from Warhammer Community doesn't actually have any information in it, but it does state that it will include updated secondary objectives. That means that we probably won't get any big primary objective scoring overhauls. I think the game would be improved by removing top of turn scoring and moving to like a more dynamic system like bottom turn scoring, like ITC used to use in 8th edition. Honestly, I think that's out of the question. I don't think that we're going to get a ground-up rework of the missions in that way. Now, GT 2020 has been in a pretty good spot ever since the January FAQ that made bottom round 5 scoring a thing for the player going second, so that there was a better dynamic first versus second player. That said, there is still a lot of improvements that could be made, so let's talk about them. Now, if primary mission objective scoring gets reworked, not just the secondary objectives, but we also see some changes to the missions themselves, I'd like to see domination objective scoring totally removed. Now, for those who don't know, that is the scoring style in which you have to hold 2 objectives in order to score 5 points, or 3 objectives in order to score 10. Whereas the majority of missions in the packet score you 5 points for holding 1 and 10 for holding 2. These objectives are way more difficult to score, and that can lead to some snowballing situations where one player getting ahead is able to keep the other player off balance, just because being able to contest your opponent down to only holding 1 objective and having them score no primaries is much easier than it would be in the standard style. You could rework the missions with this domination style scoring pretty easily. You just put less objectives on them. Overrun could have just 2 objectives in each player's deployment zone instead of 3, and then you could make it hold 1, hold 2 to score 5 or 10, and the dynamic would be very similar, but instead of entirely removing your opponent's ability to score primary objectives, you just make it a little bit more difficult. Basically, all of the domination-style missions are some of the most contentious in the book, and people are very opinionated about objectives like Scouring or Vital Intelligence. With some reworks to the objective placement, could make them a lot more fair for a lot of people. Those missions, like I mentioned before, tend to swing really heavily one way or another, and that can create a lot of negative play experiences, even if the mission itself is relatively balanced first versus second player, depending on the matchup. It could run into a situation where it just sucks to play, and that's not fun for anybody. I'd also like to remove mission rules that allow objectives to lock in if they're held for a certain period of time. So those are objectives like Sweep and Clear or Vital Intelligence, where if you hold an objective at the start of your turn, it's yours until your opponent takes it. This can, again, snowball really quickly, and especially if the first player is able to get to a lot of objectives that the second player can't easily contest early, they can often just run away with the primary objective score without much recourse that the second player has to fight back. Now, a lot of the discussion in this video is going to be about secondary objectives, so let's get started with that early and talk about mission-specific secondaries, because they're in a weird spot in GT 2020. The mission-specific secondaries are pretty hit or miss. There are only 1 or 2 that are kind of a sometimes pick that you take depending on the matchup and your list, and that's, I think, where the designers were trying to hit the balance point of those mission-specific secondaries, but they didn't really do that. On the flip side, we have priority targets, which mission-specific secondary basically gives you a free 15-point victory points at the end of the game, which is ridiculously easy, and you'll always take. So generally speaking, outside of that one mission, you almost never see these mission-specific secondaries. That said, I'd like them to play a greater part in the mission scoring itself, like either being a required pick so that everyone has to take the mission-specific secondary, alongside some balance changes to these secondaries. I think that could make the missions feel very different and unique, whereas right now it's basically just changing where the objectives on the table go. You could have the mission-specific secondaries always be active in addition to normal secondaries, and award primary points instead of secondary points, and count towards your cap of 45. That would mean that in some situations where a player can't get back into the swing of things with primary objective scoring, whether their opponent's knocking them down to 5 points every turn and they just have a tough time holding objectives at the start of their turn, they could aim to recoup those losses by scoring the mission-specific secondary, which could be a really interesting dynamic. Alternatively, you could reduce the Battleforge Painting Award to 5 points from 10, and make mission-specific secondaries like little mini-secondaries that are always active, but only score up to 5 points. That would feel a lot like the bonus points that 8th edition's ITC had, where every mission had a specific secondary you were trying to complete that only got you 1 point per round you were able to do it, and added a little bit of an additional bonus if you are able to play to the mission's strengths well. I think any of these changes could make all of the mission-specific secondaries feel really interesting and unique, and make all of the missions feel actually different from each other. With that out of the way, let's talk about standard secondaries, because there's a little bit of work to be done in the secondary game in GT 2020 so far. Obviously, reworking the secondary objectives is pretty important, and clearly we're getting it, because the article did say that we were going to get reworked secondary objectives. So let's look at some specific secondaries from the packet that we could rework. The first one, and the easiest one I think, is a fix to bring it down. A vehicle or monster with 10 wounds should be worth 2 points, not 1 point. This immediately goes a long way to assisting the less powerful factions with the Drukhari problem, and similar dedicated transport spam lists that I'm sure we're going to see in the not-too-distant future. That would make a lot of dedicated transports like Raiders and Rhinos potentially worth 3 victory points apiece if you also took Bring It Down alongside Thin Their Ranks. That would mean that spamming dedicated transports actually has a really big downside, and means that you're less incentivized to rely very heavily on that mechanic that tends to play super powerfully into the GT-style missions. And with Adeptus Mechanicus looking like it may be potentially the strongest codex in 9th edition so far, it might go a long way to help people deal with those incredibly overpowered and undercosted 10-wound flyers that Adeptus Mechanicus have, that only give up 1 Bring It Down point if you're able to chew through their insane defensive stat line. Next up, let's talk about some Shadow Ops, because these things need a little bit of a balance pass. Real talk, have you ever seen anyone take repair teleport homers? Like, ever in your life? I'm willing to bet probably not. Being a significantly less reliable version of deploy scramblers means it never sees play, and while the dynamic between raise the banners high and deploy scramblers, and in which situation one of those secondary objectives is going to be more powerful, is really interesting and a lot of times determines the balance of a mission, the other 2 secondary objectives in this category are hot garbage. There's a couple really quick fixes in here that could make things a lot better. For example, make investigate sites uncontestable. Currently, you can't perform the action if there's an enemy within 6 inches of the center of the table, which, if you've played most missions in the packet, is all the time. It's basically never a situation where you can actually perform the investigate sites action, despite the fact that even when you do, you're probably going to lose that unit immediately after, given that they're directly in the middle of the table. So without really good terrain, you're just giving up pieces in order to maybe complete a secondary if your opponent decided not to contest it. Repair teleport homers is a little bit of a tougher one. Maybe the answer is just to make it score big points, like 10 points if you complete it once and 15 if you complete it twice. It is very difficult to complete given that it can only be performed inside your opponent's deployment zone and is a full round action, meaning you have to be inside their deployment zone and they have to forget to attack you. If you made the upside way higher than deploy scramblers, I think it would be fine, but right now it requires 3 completions to score at all higher than deploy scramblers and 4 completions to max out, which is wild. At the current scoring, you could also just make it a single round action. You can only do it in your opponent's deployment zone, which is one of the most difficult places to be, especially since you have to be doing it multiple times throughout the game in order to score higher than deploy scramblers, meaning you have to be able to get multiple infantry units on multiple rounds into your opponent's deployment zone, which is already ridiculously difficult. To be honest, maybe we can just get rid of the repair teleport homers, but I do think that there's some situations that it could be fixed. I am worried that it's so similar to deploy scramblers that they end up just competing directly if repair teleport homers is a viable option in any situation. And having two almost identical secondaries in the same category feels a little unnecessary. Speaking of unnecessary, let's move on to those Warpcraft Secondaries. These were a pretty interesting experiment, but to be honest, despite how cool they are, I can't help but feel like the game might be improved if they were just removed entirely. The psychic action mechanic itself is very flawed, and it's important to remember that it is a core rulebook action, not a GT mechanic. So you can't just reprint the psychic action mechanics in a new GT pack because it's already in those advanced rules. Not only is performing a psychic action fallible, it's just unlikely because most of the warp charges and psychic actions are relatively easy, but your opponent can also deny them with just regular deny the witch attempts or some stratagems. This is unlike any other form of action, which outside of very specific abilities cannot be interacted with by your opponent once they're started. Not to mention that when a caster goes to complete a psychic action, it gives up all of its psychic casts for the turn. This is a huge downside, since Psykers pay out the nose for the ability to cast psychic powers to deal mortal wounds and support their army, and usually your lists are constructed entirely around those Psykers being there and performing their job. So that limits situations in which Warcraft secondaries are actually good to ones in which, A, you have a cheap Psyker that you don't mind taking the game off, casting any spells, or just being killed because they're trying to move up the table to complete those psychic actions. Your opponent has little to no psychic defense to stop you from completing those Warpcraft secondaries, and the mission, matchup, terrain is actually conducive to actually completing any of them. You can't really do a psychic ritual if there's nothing in the center of the table, because your caster's just going to run up, perform their psychic action, and get shot and die, which gets you nothing. What a waste of time. And in the same way, playing against like a Grey Knight army that has +1 denies absolutely out the wazoo means that even if you've built for psychic actions in your game plan, they're going to be highly inconsistent because your opponent's going to be great at denying them. This means that the times that Warpcraft secondaries are good is basically never. While on the flip side, Abhor the Witch gives basically any faction a free backup pick against any army that's relying on Psykers to complete any part of their game plan, whether or not they're able to actually take advantage of those Warpcraft secondaries themselves. Whoever thought adding Abhor the Witch into Warpcraft to balance out the secondary selection should be fired. Now, to be fair, I think it's unlikely that we see the category get removed. So, how could we fix the mechanic? Without changing the fundamentals of psychic actions, the easiest way would just be to make the secondaries easier. Make Psychic Ritual completable by multiple Psykers over the game instead of just one, and score 5 victory points per successful cast, instead of being all or nothing, which is ridiculous given the number of times that it scores 0 because your caster died. Make Pierce the Veil a deploy scrambler style secondary objective that scores more points the more table sections you completed in. Not just within 6 inches of your opponent's deployment zone, which makes no sense, but also maybe in each table quarter, or maybe in your deployment zone, your opponent's deployment zone in the middle, a la deploy scramblers, which would give you an incentive to take lots of bad Psykers and throw them all over the table. You could also add some cool psychic actions that interact with objectives in interesting ways, like having to cast a particular psychic action while in range of objectives outside your deployment zone to corrupt them. Or maybe have a low scoring but relatively easy ritual style secondary that performs a ritual on one of the objectives in your deployment zone. You could have the objective get picked before the game so your opponent knows which ones to direct their anti-psyker technology at. There's lots of options to improve these Warpcraft secondaries, even if you want to keep them in the game. So hopefully we see that happen in the GT2021 packet. Now, before we move off secondaries, I've got one more thing to add, which is that GT 2020 has a distinct lack of cool narrative in its secondary objectives, or even its primary objectives, to be perfectly honest. I'm a firm believer that competition and narrative play aren't mutually exclusive. You can still have cool and interesting narrative mechanics in a game designed for competition, as long as they also introduce interesting options for those competitive players. So, where are secondaries that forge a narrative outside of killing units and standing in places? Why can't we have a desperate retrieval of the Death Star plans from the Scarif facility by picking up a token placed by your opponent on one of their objectives and holding it until the end of the game? Where is this secondary that represents the final forlorn defense of a particular piece of the table? Why aren't there secondaries representing a high command mandated assault on a particular area of your opponent's deployment zone? How come none of these are represented in the game? There's a distinct lack of flavor in these secondary objectives so far, which is something that's too bad because it was something I was hoping for when GT 2020 originally got previewed. I think it's definitely possible, and I hope it's something that we see, to inject that flavor back into the secondary objectives in the GT 2021 packet. Now, speaking of flavor, that brings me to the final and most important part of this wish list. We have to totally rethink our mission naming structure. I know there's zero chance of this happening, given that Games Workshop has used the same nomenclature for missions for the last 10 years, but why does battle lines involve overrunning the center of the table with overwhelming force in order to control those two midfield objectives, while overrun requires you to form a battle line in your deployment zone and hold your objectives against your opponent's attack? That makes no sense. Why does retrieval mission have nothing to do with retrieving anything, but surround and destroy just encourages a straight up fight in the middle of the table that doesn't involve surrounding anything or even potentially destroying it? These objective names are silly and need to be thought through. Do better next time, GW. I believe in you. You can name objectives according to how they play out on the table. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for watching to the end of the video, everyone. I hope everyone is excited for this GT 2021 packet, and if you are, let me know what you're looking for in this new packet in the comments down below. Also, if you like this style of video, obviously drop the like, drop the subscribe. It's the YouTube stuff. You know the YouTube stuff. We talk about the YouTube stuff all the time. And also, big thanks to my patrons over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, as well as the YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All of those people are phenomenal, and I love them, and they help support the channel, they help me make content, and they're just great. Thanks for watching all the way to the real end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.